Hillary has been lengthening her excuses as to why she lost the election. She didn't really lose the election. It was stolen from her by, I think it's up to 24 different excuses she has now. Number 24 is content farms in Macedonia. And as I said, my grandfather was a Macedonian content farmer, and we often think about, gathering on the porch and recalling the old days on the Macedonian. He never thought that the old content farmers he left behind in Macedonia would one day steal the U.S. presidential election. They are gnarled, hard-working Macedonian
welcome
peasants.
To the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast. This is another exciting episode 13. We are recording on Thursday, February 7, 2019. My name is Jason Miko, coming to you from Oro Valley, Arizona, and the foot of the Catalina Mountains.
And this is Cvetin calling in from Skopje. I'm closer to the Vardar River than to any mountain, and the closest mountain I got here is Mount Vodno, the overly used trimming track for all the Skopjaners around here.
I still like Vodno. I love Vodno. I remember fondly many hikes up Vodno, and then from Vodno over to Matka, and then down Matka Canyon, and you reward yourself with a great big lunch down there. I think it's called the, I forgot the name of the restaurant. Bear? I can't remember.
They redid it a lot. The one next to the church, It's now a very posh place, like all fancy foods and stuff. It's unrecognizable from what it used to be.
Yeah, well, I fondly remember that, and next time I'm back there, if weather's good, of course, I want to do that. But we are not here to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about Macedonia, and never a dull moment, especially this past week. Actually, too much news, in my opinion. Macedonia signed the NATO accession protocol. I think that's the correct way of describing it, in Brussels. And now the 29 member states of NATO will agree or perhaps disagree to Macedonia's membership in NATO. And I thought we'd start off because, Cvetin, you and I follow social media so much, and folks are using social media to talk about the news and what's going on in Macedonia and NATO, etc. And apparently Macedonia is the emoji country, because everybody seems to be using the emoji flag of Macedonia because they are uncomfortable saying Macedonia. They're uncomfortable saying North Macedonia. They're uncomfortable saying Skopje. They're uncomfortable saying Northern Macedonia. They're uncomfortable saying former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. They don't know what to do when, of course, the clear answer is just say Macedonia, because that's the name of the country. And I saw that NATO used the Macedonian flag emoji for the language. Yep. So it wasn't even an issue of not wanting to say the name. It was wanting to avoid saying the language. And so they've got English, French, Russian, and then the Macedonian flag. You gotta laugh.
Yeah, the language is the one thing that was supposed to be most strongly protected in the agreement, unlike the nationality, where you can insist that, well, it's not nationality, it's citizenship, but the language was supposed to be recognized by the Prespa agreement, with some caveat that it's a Slavic language, which is essentially true.
Blah, blah, blah.
But then the problem is that the language brings another country into the mix, because Bulgaria does not recognize the language. It insists that the Macedonian language, according to them, is the Western dialect of the Bulgarian language, which is spoken in the Republic of Northern Macedonia. But if they use Macedonian as official language, then Bulgaria would probably object. Bulgaria called the Macedonian language in its agreement, which it got Zaev to sign, the official language according to the constitution of the country, something like that. So they're avoiding using the word Macedonian language.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And I see that there saw a news article just pop up, in the past couple of hours here. The Bulgarian Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, Krasimir Karakachanov, has complained again about Macedonia. He says, well, anyway, we know what he's saying. He's going to use every opportunity to complain about Macedonia calling itself Macedonia or the Macedonian language or the Macedonian people, etc.
Yeah, sorry, that's not even the craziest thing Karakachanov did lately. He's actually, this is now a side issue for him. His main issue right now is he's promoting a plan for the Roma minority in Bulgaria, which includes organizing like work, these communist-style brigades, which would clean up the Roma ghettos. They're actually using this word. And he's going to obviously abolish end welfare if you do not educate your children, which is reducing the welfare state. The Roma are horribly served by the welfare state. But then he's coming out in favor of doing something, he says, about the very high demographics of the Roma community and making abortion more accessible.
Wow.
That's an interesting, character.
When are parliamentary elections in Bulgaria? We need regime change there.
It would probably be more Karakachanov in the next elections. I mean, this is the way they're going. This is the way Europe is going. So I don't think.
Oh yeah, because he's not from the same party as Boyko Borisov, is he?
Oh,
I can't remember.
He's from the Vimera party. He has a Vimera party.
Oh, okay, right. Okay,
but
yes.
The Bulgarian Vimera, and he insists that they are the real Vimera and.
Well, again, going back to what we started with, kind of, again, back on the social media, because it's fun and we follow it, seeing that people they're not sure if they should say North or Northern. And the so-called Prespa agreement clearly lays out what it should be. But even in the Macedonian language, I know it's a bit confusing. And, of course, the simple answer to all this is all thinking people just say Macedonia.
Well, we say Republika Severna Macedonia. I mean, this is what the name that is imposed on us, and it would translate into English as Northern, not North.
Yeah.
If you would say Republika Sever Macedonia, that makes no sense in Macedonian, but that would be the translation of Republic of North Macedonia. I don't really think it makes much difference for us. I mean, we used to argue a lot about whether we should accept words like Skopje into the name, which would then easily turn into, we would find ourselves being forced to call our language Skopjan language instead of Macedonian, or using Skopjaner for the nationality instead of Macedonian. So this is something we desperately wanted to avoid. Obviously didn't want to use any name change for domestic purposes. We'll see. I mean, it will be difficult for the Greeks to impose a new language like the Northern language without Macedonian. I mean, Northern Macedonia probably means that the name of the language will remain Macedonian. I'm more interested at this point into what it would look like for the foreign languages. Like in English, we practically know what it would be. In German, it's going to sound very, very ugly. It would be a one word. They wouldn't say Northern Macedonia like two words. They would say Nord Macedonian, one word. And then in the French, the Latin languages, I think it would then be Republic of Macedonia del Norte or du Nord.
Right.
So then it's different. Then in these languages, we preserve the Republic of Macedonia, and the adjective goes at the end. So I guess the Greeks will be looking into ways to make it more mixed up, try to avoid having this clean Republic of Macedonia used anywhere in any language.
Right. And, of course, one of the benefits of listening to this podcast, the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast, is we give you, our listeners, real and practical information. And, of course, as regards the name, the simplest thing to do is just to say Macedonia. It's shorter. It saves time. Everybody wants to save time. And it's very descriptive. Everybody knows Macedonia and the Macedonians. So this is going to be interesting to watch it play out and see what happens. And that's something that we're going to be obviously monitoring. Of course, again, all thinking people will simply say Macedonia, Macedonians, and Macedonian when referring to the language. And that's just the way it's going to be, whether they like it or not. And it'll be fun to watch them throw temper tantrums over this. Let's move kind of a little bit into, we've got European elections coming up in May for the European Parliament. We see some of the candidates for the major parties that are campaigning. Brexit, we're not exactly sure how that's going to play out and whatnot. But taking a kind of a 30,000 foot, 10,000 meter perspective here, looking at the whole thing, we see that there's this growing rift in the European Union over the center right and they call them nationalists, sovereigntists, whatever you want to call them, the nation, those who believe in the nation state, and the progressives, the far left, those that want to destroy the nation state and sovereignty, etc. I see that the former Prime Minister of Macedonia, Nikola Gruevski, has kind of he's started talking. I don't know if it was a proper interview or his social media. Why don't you bring us up to speed on what Gruevski said about kind of this new battle for the Macedonian name and identity after it joins NATO and the European Union?
Yeah, he did both. He had a proper TV interview, albeit a relatively short one, with Citel television from Budapest. But then, more importantly, he now published a two-part extensive Facebook comment, which is essentially his, he calls it a paradigm change, a paradigm shift on the name issue. Basically, he acknowledges that the concept of resolving the name issue with a fair, normal, we would call it човечки, like a human, like compromise with the Greeks, a reasonable compromise with the Greeks, has failed after he uses the word extensively. A puppet government was installed in Macedonia by
Good description.
The internationals who pressed so strongly to remove him from office. Yeah. And then his point going forward is that we shouldn't do anything which would prolong our accession into EU and NATO. NATO should be a given. The accession protocol is signed. Full membership should follow within less than a year. That is his estimate as well. He puts EU membership at between 6 and 8 years, and he believes that we should not try to impede this process, even though he acknowledges that emotionally everybody here, and you know, I feel it, people feel it here, we wish all the worst to all those who pushed us down this road, and the internationals, the Europeans, their domestic collaborators, and obviously we wish that, you know, my point is that whichever outcome brings Zaev closest to being kidnapped by the people he overpromised to and underdelivered, and then he gets what he deserves, you know, that's the best for me. Gruevski is taking a rational, a reasonable approach. He says we should join these institutions, and then we should start the fight for Macedonian statehood, national identity, obviously the name, which is maybe the smallest part of all these things, from within the institutions, from the position of already having veto power, having an equal position with Greece and Bulgaria and other countries within these institutions, that basically the fun starts then and there, after we join these two institutions, and that we shouldn't do anything to impede the process in the next several years, no matter how personally humiliating and exhausting that is. He believes that once we join, that one part of the international community which was leading the charge to pressure us to change our name and bring down the government and install these idiots in power would lose interest. The part of the internationals who actually care about having another NATO member, it would still leave other internationals more closer to us, our neighbors who were not involved in this process because they wanted a member state of NATO and the EU as a neighbor. They wanted Macedonia dissolved, our national identity destroyed, morphed into Bulgarians or Serbs if Serbia could get away with it, or Greece could influence the process, divided between Macedonians and Albanians, or Bulgarians and Albanians, etc. So these powers would still continue pressuring for the demise of Macedonia, and Gruevski believes that, you know, this is where we should fight in the interim period, but all the while doing everything we can to actually join the two institutions so we could reduce the pressure from foreign countries onto us.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think I see more and more people in the Macedonian community, Macedonians in Macedonia, and then, of course, here in the diaspora, talking about this. What do we do next? How do we do it? And I think what you're saying is Gruevski's saying, you know, we fight it from the inside. And I think a lot of people are, you know, you have to, you accept that. You accept what has been done. It's wrong. It's unfair. Of course, life isn't about fairness. And then you work to change it over time. That's what they've done, and now it goes back, and now it's our turn to work to change it. I want to bring up an article that I just posted recently by my friend Mario Hristovski from Ohio. He's actually born in Bitola, but he's an American citizen. He wrote a pretty good article here on what to do next. He says the Prespa agreement is a mess. Here's what we do next. And we'll put this up in the show notes, but let me just read a little bit. He says the Prespa agreement is a monstrosity. It's moral and political spew on every ground. Every one of its pages imbues the Orwellian warning, quote, the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history, unquote. Not only does it suffocate the cries of ethnic cleansing from the not-so-distant past, but it also attempts to draw a moral equivalence between the parties as being co-equal aggressors and transgressors in this dispute. And then he goes on to say the Prespa agreement is nowhere near the level of brutality we've seen in the past. However, it can be if we let it. If we sit back, continue complaining vocally but doing nothing, and thus allowing our children, grandchildren, and posterity to be eradicated. This won't happen overnight. It's an ever slow drip of complacency and indifference that accumulates over time to a nightmarish reality. Then he goes on to explain, what do you do? And his answer, I think, is you strengthen the church, the family, the community in Macedonia and outside of Macedonia to talk about the importance of history and heritage and culture, and to pass that on to the children, to make sure, because we know that the agreement, the Prespa agreement and the agreement with Bulgaria are going to try and eradicate Macedonia's history and heritage in the textbooks. And so that's part of it. And so I think, going back, just taking a step back, I think this is what we are going to see more and more of in Macedonia and in the diaspora, is coming up with these important points, these strategies on how to battle this as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously in a roundabout way, in a upside down way, I'm actually hoping that Greece and Bulgaria to a lesser extent will try to use the two agreements to the maximum extent, because otherwise, this is why we were complaining against these agreements, why we were complaining about the name issue in general, that it's not just a small cosmetic change which everybody can live with. Somebody will use an emoji instead of North Macedonia, somebody will say Macedonia and then will be shouted at by Greeks, but then nobody would call us Northerners. That's stupid. But it's not a cosmetic change. Since the beginning, we insisted that it's actually all-out assault on the Macedonian national identity and sovereignty. And, if Greeks and Bulgarians are lazy and do not use the whole armament given them by the two articles, us opponents of the deal will certainly look out stupid, and nobody wants to be seen as stupid. Obviously, we all know that they're not going to be lazy. They're going to be meticulous about this. They're going to be in your face about it. They're going to demand regular government meetings, committee meetings, and going to impose new requests, new demands, especially once the the right-wing party takes over in Greece, as will happen soon. They're going to demand things that no sane, normal, self-regarding nation would accept. Other than that, again, I agree with the point that we should join EU and NATO at this point. I've been a staunch opponent of joining the European Union. I've been pro-NATO, but after what has been done to the country, I obviously have zero respect for the institution and wish it all the worst. But again, these two organizations are so badly designed, so misshaped, offer so wrong set of incentives for their member countries, incentivizing the member states not to spend enough money on their own self-defense, try to piggyback on the United States, more importantly in the EU, incentivizing them to run up huge debts and then go running to Germany demanding for a handout. I believe that at this point, causing maximum damage to these institutions would be to have a deeply frustrated, angry, impoverished country like Macedonia with exceptionally skewed political processes inside and destroyed rule of law, etc. As a member state will do more damage to them. When Gruevski speaks, let's join them, he kind of almost gives like an impression that these are sensible, worthwhile institutions. He doesn't say this, but we get this impression. But I would support joining them, hoping that we would be able to do as much damage as Greece did per capita. And I'm pretty sure we will. I mean, pretty soon we'll have, Zaev misappropriating, stealing, essentially, European Union funding, Macedonian people smugglers taking migrants straight to Germany with even more ease as they relax our travel regime, etc. Poor people from Macedonia, Roma especially. This has been happening for a while, but it could become even more prominent, going to Germany demanding political economic asylum, as they call it, essentially living there on government handouts. So, they want us so badly inside. They were willing to put us through all of this in order to have us as a member. Fine. They did their worst. Now it's our turn. We'll do our worst.
Tell us, Cvetin, how do you really feel about these organizations? Well,
don't hold back.
Don't hold back. Well, taking a step back, and we could do a podcast every week on what I'm about to say. But both the European Union and NATO were created in response to the two world wars and the rise of the Soviet Union. They're both institutions created as a result of those wars, and then the Cold War, of course. The European Union, and it's little known, but the European Union is actually an American creation. The CIA and it's well documented, the CIA had a large hand in the creation of the European Union. And originally it was supposed to be just an economic trading bloc. And I have no problem with that. The problem I have with the European Union is it's become this all-encompassing leviathan, this sovereignty-sucking project that demands ever closer union and more sovereignty away from the individual nation states and vests it in Brussels in unelected men and women who have no responsibility or accountability to the parliaments, the sovereign parliaments that are elected by the people in the individual nation states. Now that's all I'll say on the European Union. On the NATO side, NATO obviously was created in response to the Soviet Union. I think what do they say? It was designed to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. It's a Cold War institution, and we all know the history that after 1991, after the Berlin Wall fell, and then after 1991 and the Soviet Union ceased to exist, it didn't really know what it was supposed to be doing, and it started going what they call out of area, and that's why you've had it. We saw the well-documented involvement in the countries of the former Yugoslavia in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I remember Bill Clinton saying in 1995, we're going to go in there for 1 year and then we're going to leave. We still have troops there. And so NATO has been looking for its raison d'etre, its reason for existence. And I don't think it's still really found that. But anyway, these are discussions that we could, spend hours or days or weeks on. But okay, so we know Gruevski's position. We certainly know your position. It will be very interesting to see going forward. Just kind of switching subjects very slightly to the cost of NATO membership, since that's where we are today, and nobody's really been talking about what is it going to cost Macedonia in terms of actual payments. In terms of actual payments to upgrade its security forces, its military. To say nothing, of course, of the cost of the PRESPA agreement. Have there been any estimates on that yet?
Oh, yeah. Well, not on the PRESPA thing. That's open-ended and, just God knows, replacing every single piece of paper which has the word Macedonia on it in this country is going to be excruciatingly expensive and time-consuming. Also, the other law which was passed to placate the Albanians in all this process, which is bilingualism in Macedonia, which is another way in which the country is being redefined. But we had Defense Minister Shekerinska come out, and she insisted that we're only going to spend 1.2 million euros for NATO. Imagine that.
Wow.
That sounds pretty cheap. Obviously,
that's a bargain.
She's talking only about the I believe the administrative costs of NATO membership, like paying the rent or keeping the lights on, in reality, we spend about 120 million for defense, and that includes a bloated defense bureaucracy. This doesn't all go into fighting forces. A lot of this is like travel and these plush dinners and lunches given by the defense ministry. But let's say 120 million. Our economy is about 11, almost 12 billion euros, which means if we're supposed to spend 2%, we should double our defense budget. We should go over 200 million. And Shekerinska, to her credit, acknowledged this, and she said that by 2024 we should reach this number. So we would more than double, or almost double, the defense budget in what's it now? 3 more years, which is unbelievable, incredible. It's going to include all sorts of waste and mismanagement and outright theft and abuse. But the funniest thing, this is what I'm looking forward to. You know, our friend Vlatko Djurcev is in Washington right now, and he posted a photograph with Tucker Carlson. He met Tucker, he met Sean Hannity. Tucker is the guy who actually caused this huge ruckus with Montenegro when he actually saw Trump as he does, and he asked him, well, you know, there is this country, Montenegro, and Trump went off. They're violent people, which they are, obviously. Montenegro has been in war with all its neighbors within my lifetime, within very recently. It split from one neighbor and went to war with all the others, except with Italy, which is across the sea. But actually, Italy bombarded Montenegro. It fought with Kosovo, fought Croatia, besieged Dubrovnik, went to war with Albania by proxy, if you consider the Kosovo war. You know, and Trump went ballistic. So I can expect that shortly, at some point, Tucker will see Trump again and mention, well, remember Montenegro? There is another country with from the same region with a similar name.
With the letter that starts with the letter N, not N. So yes.
And let me tell you how much they spend on defense. Nothing.
Yeah.
It's going to be
well, of course. A quick aside: we have Tucker Carlson to thank for the name of this podcast, because he had Mark Steyn on some years ago. Well, right after the 2016 election, and Steyn talked about the Macedonian content farmers. Yeah. But going back to the spending issue, of course, this is a legitimate complaint of President Trump and the people that elected him, is that European nations who are members of NATO have not spent what they should spend on the collective defense, which has, and we, the American taxpayer, have been paying for it, which has allowed the European nations to create their very, very generous welfare states, whereas Americans, don't have that same thing. And so it's a legitimate complaint. We've read articles and listened to pundits and analysts on both sides say, one thing or the other. But going back to the original point on Macedonia spending what it needs to spend and what it's going to cost, and actually this is a good segue then. How is NATO membership going to tangibly benefit and positively impact the everyday lives of Macedonian citizens? Riddle me that, Batman.
I mean, honestly, when Yugoslavia was falling apart, when there were wars all around us, being a member of NATO would bring a huge premium, security would bring a huge premium. At this point, most of our neighbors are in NATO or occupied by NATO, but like Kosovo. So, realistically, a conflict, the source of conflict was actually Kosovo, twice for Macedonia. Especially during the political crisis in 2015, when a group of Kosovars attacked the city of Kumanovo here, and they're coming, attacking us. They're literally crossing through the largest NATO-US military base in the region, which is Bonsteel. So to say that we're going to get some additional security by joining NATO while we're being attacked from a NATO protectorate, it's ludicrous. It's ridiculous.
But on the economic side, how is that going to benefit tangibly the everyday Macedonian in his or her life?
I don't see it, honestly. I mean,
I don't either. But I just want to bring this up real quick. I saw a tweet the other day from the Dutch ambassador, I'm not going to mispronounce his name. Wouter Plump.
Okay.
He put out a tweet. This was actually just after Macedonia signed the accession accord. And he said in the tweet, it said, hashtag NATO membership. So NATO membership brings economic growth and jobs. Good day for Macedonian flag imagery. Private sector and visiting Alkaloid, employing 1,400 mostly young skilled people in Skopje. Okay, good, true. So, but the point of his tweet was trying to tie NATO membership brings economic growth and jobs, and then he tied that in by visiting Alkaloid. And I had to point out, Alkaloid was founded in 1936 in Macedonia, 13 years before NATO was founded, and it's been a wonderful company and employed and exported, despite the fact that Macedonia's never been a NATO member. So I was a little bit confused as to, he's visiting Alkaloid to make the point that NATO membership brings economic growth and benefits, but Alkaloid's done just fine without NATO membership. Thank you very much.
And you know which country is the major foreign market for Alkaloid?
No.
Russia. Well, we were joking.
Oh, the ironies practically write themselves.
We were joking today. Zaev, he made this populist promise that he's going to remove the iron fence from around the government building, and they did it. Ultimately, they did this today, and we were joking. Well, good, they're clearing up the approach for the expected deluge of foreign investors coming here, begging to invest in Macedonia. So we don't want them cramming through the narrow gateway. They can now enter the government from all sides and try to sign their contracts. But seriously, this is ridiculous. I mean, nobody expects this anymore.
Well, in fairness to Zoran Zaev, he did last fall, I believe, welcome Kentucky Fried Chicken to Macedonia as a foreign investor. And, I'm not sure how many, probably maybe dozens of jobs in the service sector.
Easily.
And I like Kentucky Fried Chicken, or KFC as they've rebranded themselves. But here's the point. Let's be serious for a moment. Yeah, NATO membership, sure, it has that good housekeeping stamp of approval. And again, Macedonia is not in NATO yet. It won't be until all 29 countries sign the accession accords. But even then, foreign investors are going to be looking at Macedonia. They're not looking at the fact that it is or about to become a NATO member in a vacuum or by itself. They're looking at the totality of the picture of what is going on in Macedonia, the whole issue of corruption. And I'm going to I'm going to talk about my farmer's picks a little bit later towards the end, but it has to do with that. The whole issue of corruption, which Zaev promised to tackle, which he hasn't tackled. The whole issue of regional security and stability. And as you just pointed out, Kosovo is still going to be a source of, I think, regional insecurity, and especially as they continue talking with Serbia, and that's a whole other subject we get into it, etc. So my point being that foreign companies aren't just saying, "Oh, you're a member of NATO, or you're going to be a member of NATO. We're going to come in and invest hundreds of millions of euros." That's not the way it works.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to be to have international institutions which promote free markets, promote individualism, personal responsibility, etc., and which are essentially anti-communist. I mean, I would love to be a member of an older NATO. And I was a strong supporter of this. But at this point, these organizations and the countries they represent are set up in a way that they're no longer beacons of free markets and personal responsibility and individualism. They're actually, in some cases, actively promoting utopian left-wing socialist dreams of, supranationalism, and they're actively trying to confront. I have absolutely very little love lost for Russia, but it's no longer the communist country you need to fight. I mean, if you want to pick an ideological foe, there are other, China or the radical Islamic countries. They would be you would argue, you could say that they're far more worthy of being reformed, broken, and then reassembled, if this is what you want to do, than Russia, which is just like a largely normal oligarchic, spoiler, troublemaker, of course, country. But ideologically, I do not see a reason to confront it at this point, that it no longer is communist. NATO would not help us in the problem we will have, which would be separatism, especially by the Albanian minority. They do not help countries with this. They could not help, the United Kingdom with Scotland, or Spain with Catalonia, or the Turks with the Kurdish insurgency. They would do nothing about this. But in fact, getting us to be beaten down to the point that we accept joining NATO under these humiliating circumstances meant that Macedonians relinquish a lot of their national sovereignty in the country, in Macedonia, which in turn emboldened Albanian separatism and nationalism. So pushing us into this allegedly beacon of stability actually made us less stable, because it whetted Albanian nationalist appetites, and now there will be no putting them back in the bottle.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned ideological battles and adversaries, and you bring up a very good point. Obviously, I think China is the number one potential adversary of the United States and Western civilization.
Still communists, go fight them.
Yeah, of course. Oh yeah. No. Yeah. They are absolutely dyed-in-the-wool communists. Then radical Islamism, radical Islamic extremism. But then the other one, I think, and this is something I want to, as hopefully news starts to, we don't have this deluge of daily news about Macedonia that's going on. I want to think about it. I've been thinking about it for a long time, reading about it, writing about it here and there. I want to write more about it and talk about it. And that is the creeping ideological battle within Western civilization itself. And it's kind of funny because the lone voice in the wilderness in the last century that was trying to warn the West about this was a Russian, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and his voice is still loud and clear today. I see more and more pundits writing about what he said in his warning to the West about the dangers of secular militant atheism and the radical personal autonomy and radical individualism. All of these things, of course, are creeping into the West, and eventually will bring it down from within. And we can talk about parallels in history and etc., but we're not going to go there now. But anyway, let's move on. But before we do that, let's take a break to allow our listeners to, of course, they can always push the pause button. This is a podcast after all. But why don't you and I take a break and grab a refreshing beverage. You're listening to the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast. We'll be right back.
There's all these stories about, guys over in Macedonia who are running these fake news sites.
And welcome back to the Macedonian Content Farmers Podcast. Jason Miko and Cvetin Chilmanov. Cvetin, it's time for our farmers picks. What are yours?
Well, I'm keeping in line with what we're discussing so far. I was reading an article in the New Statesman about the European Union, and I think it's interesting to share with our readers. This is it's written by a historian called Brendan Sims.
I just started reading that article earlier, and then I got distracted. I have to go back to it. So fill me in on that. I'm interested.
Well, it's a good parallel between the 30-Year War and the conflict between the Catholic Church and the Reformation. But he's stumbling.
Can you let our readers, let our listeners know? You say the 30-Year War, like everybody knows what that is.
That was the one where the German statelets were fighting each other, whether they fall under the newly founded Protestant church, or if they're going to stick with the Catholic Church, and then all sorts of good
in the 1600s. But that's the important part.
16th century, and all sorts of good stuff like the sacking of Magdeburg happened, and he makes a point that even after the Second World War, Germans still considered the 30-Year War to be more savage and worse than the First World War and the Second World War combined. Just to give you an impression of how badly things were. I think they depopulated regions of Germany to the extent of more than half the population were killed, slaughtered, expelled, and starved to death. But he's trying to make also a point about how it was an important feature of this conflict was the decision by England to split from the Catholic Church to declare itself an empire, and how
Henry VIII.
yes, and how this affected the Catholic Church, the Catholic leaders who did not want to have a repeat of this development, and this easily, seamlessly flows into more recent developments when the United Kingdom is again trying to sort of, kind of leave the European Union, and the EU reaction, especially now that we have Donald Tusk, of all people, the President of the European Council, going all fire and brimstone against the British politicians for trying to leave the European Union, telling them there is...
Oh, his tweet the other day was infantile.
Yeah, like no place...
Special place. He said. I think he said something. I'd like to know the special place in hell for the Brexiteers who didn't plan, or something like that. Oh,
It's absolutely goes hand in hand with all these images we have of, children sitting there draped with the EU flag in the European Parliament, and these emotional comments from the bureaucratic interns who are doing the EU Twitter accounts, or this other tweet from the European Union, which was like, the EU flag emoji is peace, EU flag emoji is love, EU flag emoji is democracy and respect for human rights. Like, excuse me while I puke.
did you throw up a little in your mouth?
A lot. And he makes a point that the Brexit project was thus Empire 2.0. Not so much in the global 19th century sense, but in the sense of making the UK, to use the language of the 1533 Parliamentary Act of Appeals, once more an empire unto itself. That is a sovereign, legal and political space. This was primarily an assertion of authority, rather than the articulation of doctrinal differences. It was, so to speak, a Henry VIII moment. The response of the EU to this challenge, in some respects, resembled that of the Old Church and Catholic Europe to the Reformation. The sentiment was manifest in the response of Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the European Commission, to Theresa May's hope that they could make a success of Brexit. Brexit, he said, Juncker, cannot be a success. There could be no salvation outside the Union, just as there was no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. Brexit was an offense, not merely to the European order, but to the European imaginary. In short, the EU is a cult.
Amen. Preach it. Yes, it is. Wow, and that's all from the Spectator article, right?
The New Statesman.
The New Statesman.
You would imagine you would read something
excellent.
like this in the Spectator, but no, it's the New Statesman.
Yeah, right. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, and I think it's important to point out, that you mentioned the 30 Years' War ended in 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia, which wasn't a single treaty, but that's neither here nor there. It was referred to as the Peace of Westphalia, which basically set the stage for the rise of nation states, which has been world order since that time. And of course, now we see, as you were just alluding to, this attempt to dismantle the nation state and create empires again. That's an excellent farmer's pick. Thank you.
And what have you got prepared for us?
Well, sort of on the same thing. It's kind of a two-part. I want to set the stage with the American Chamber of Commerce in Macedonia, which is supposed to be pursuing, economic development and job creation, etc., for Macedonian companies. I should know I was the first executive director of the AmCham back in 2001, but I saw that they just put out a, quote, call for socially beneficial ideas, unquote. And they start by saying, yes, we are opening a call for ideas that solve social issues, contribute to social prosperity, and promote socially progressive values.
Not free market or
and I find
values, just
socially progressive values, which is kind of funny because back in August, the American Chamber of Commerce, together with Macedonia 2025 and Mazet, put out a press release stating the recent announcement for possible introduction of progressive taxation on personal income took the private sector by surprise and raised a lot of concerns. So on the one hand here, they're promoting now socially progressive values, but they don't like socially progressive income taxes, which I find ironic.
Yeah, it's marvelous. So the U.S. Embassy was promoting far leftist people, including in the economy, especially in the realm of going post-national on us and moving away from national paradigm, a nation-state paradigm, but also in the economy. And now they're increasing taxes, increasing regulation, And AmCham is obviously hit, but still they want to do an outreach and give even more money, their own money, to progressive leftist NGOs and thinkers and promote progressive policies. And this is essentially what Lenin once said, that these capitalists, they're going to sell us the rope to hang them with. This is what it's
absolutely coming to. Yeah. Bloody hell. And of course the AmCham position on socially progressive values, when they should be promoting jobs and business growth in Macedonia, leads me to what is actually my farmer's pick. It's the 2019 Index of Economic Freedom, put out by the Conservative Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. They have just released it. Macedonia is in there, as it is each year, and I find that this is interesting. So Zaev has been in government now for almost 2 years, and he campaigned on, anti-corruption, and he didn't actually campaign on the name change, but that we all knew that's what he was. But he also talked about, bringing in foreign investment and things like that. We've alluded to that already. But the 2019 Index of Economic Freedom, put out by the Heritage Foundation, Macedonia actually declined. And let me just quote here, its overall score has decreased by 0.2 percentage of a point, with declines in trade freedom, monetary freedom, and business freedom. Fiscal policy has been lax, with unproductive public expenditures, including subsidies and pension increases, and rising guarantees for the debt of state-owned enterprises. So it's a very small decrease, but it's a decrease nonetheless. And that's not good for Macedonia. And again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, NATO membership and the idea of foreign investors coming in, they're not looking just at that. They're looking at things like this as well. And if Zoran Zaev and his government want to bring in foreign direct investment, then they're going to have to change their tune on the economy, and they're going to have to do a lot more and work much harder to see reforms in monetary freedom, business freedom, taxes. Of course, we know that the government of Nikola Gruevski introduced a flat tax, as was wildly popular throughout Europe because it worked. And this government has increased progressive taxation, as we just talked about for a moment. So, bravo, Zoki, on seeing freedom in Macedonia.
Yeah, come back, Nikola, always forgiven.
Good. Well, we've had a very robust podcast, I think, wouldn't you say?
I would certainly say so.
Yep. I think next week we'll have more to talk about. Hopefully there will be less actual, this deluge, as I said earlier, of daily news, and maybe we can talk about some more long-term things. But we'll see. We'll see what next week brings.
Don't count on
Always
that.
a pleasure talking to you.
If Gruevski puts the time frame to the next 6 to 8 years, this is going to be 6 to 8 years of non-stop news.
Okay, well then we've got to figure out how to make this pay, and then we could do twice a week, and again, sponsors. We're always looking for sponsors for the literally tens of listeners that we have.
Okay, maybe AmCham can pay us, and we can do something like a progressive podcast.
Oh, I like that. Yes, we will. I'll reach out to them right away. Hey, always great talking to you.
Buddy. Take care.